January 1854, Henrico County, Virginia. Samuel Rutledge grabbed the midwife by the throat and slammed her against the wall. "You saw nothing," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "Say one word about those fingers, one word, and I will bury you where no one looks." Behind the door, a newborn screamed. A baby born from a woman owned by 3 brothers. A baby with 6 fingers. And those 6 fingers were about to destroy everything. Subscribe now and drop your city below. Let's see how far this truth travels. The auction block in New Orleans smelled like sweat, river mud, and something worse. The particular stench of human beings being treated like livestock on a warm April morning in 1852. Most of the crowd that day had come for field hands, strong backs, calloused hands. Men who could work cotton from sunrise to dark without breaking. But Samuel Rutledge had not come for that. He stood near the back of the crowd with his arms crossed and his jaw set, watching the parade of human misery with the cold, calculating eye of a man who had already made up his mind before he arrived. His brother Thomas stood beside him, scribbling numbers in a small leather ledger. His youngest brother Edward lingered a few feet back, hat pulled low, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. "There," Samuel said quietly. Thomas looked up from his ledger. A young woman had been pushed onto the platform. She was unlike anyone in the crowd had ever seen. Her skin was the color of bleached linen, white as bone, almost translucent in the morning sun. Her hair, loosely bound behind her neck, was the pale silver of a woman 3 times her age. And her eyes, pale gray, almost colorless, moved slowly across the crowd with an expression that was not fear, not resignation. Not the hollow vacancy that grief sometimes carved into the faces of people sold too many times. Her eyes held something that made grown men uncomfortable. She was watching them the way a person watches a storm from inside a window, like she already knew what was coming, like she had already survived worse. "That's her," Samuel said again. $4,000, Thomas muttered, looking down at his numbers. "Samuel, that's insane. She's not a field hand. She can't even work in direct sun without—" "I know what she is," Samuel cut him off. Edward finally spoke from behind them, his voice low and strained. "Samuel, tell me what we're actually doing here." Samuel didn't answer right away. He watched as the auctioneer grabbed the young woman's arm and lifted it, displaying her the way a merchant displays a bolt of unusual fabric. "Her name is Clara," the auctioneer called out to the crowd. "Albino negress, approximately 19 years of age. Rare condition of birth, no documented illness, strong constitution despite appearances. Purchased originally from a sugar plantation outside Baton Rouge. Quiet disposition, no history of defiance." "No history of defiance," Samuel repeated softly, almost to himself. "Good." "Samuel," Edward's voice had an edge now. "What are we doing?" Samuel turned to face his youngest brother. His expression was not cruel, exactly. It was something more frightening than cruelty. It was rational, composed. The face of a man who had already run the numbers, weighed the costs, and made his peace with the answer. "Father's will," Samuel said simply. 3 years. We have 3 years to produce a legitimate male heir, or the plantation goes to the Hartwell cousins. You know that." "So marry someone," Edward said. "There are families in Richmond who would—" "And split the estate 3 ways through marriage settlements?" Thomas interrupted, snapping his ledger shut. 3 wives means 3 sets of lawyers, 3 sets of family claims, 3 sets of inheritance disputes the moment any one of us dies. We've been through this." "What we've been through," Edward said quietly, "is not the same as what you're proposing now." Samuel turned back to the platform, Clara had not moved. She was still watching the crowd with those pale, steady eyes, and for just a moment, Samuel felt something shift in his chest. Not conscience, something closer to unease, like a man who reaches into a dark space and feels something move against his hand before he can see what it is. He shook it off. $4,000, he said to Thomas. Bid. The gavel came down. Clara was loaded into a covered wagon before noon. She did not scream. She did not plead. She sat in the corner of the wagon with her knees drawn up and her pale eyes fixed on nothing. And the only sign that she was anything other than a statue was the slow, steady rise and fall of her chest. Edward rode alongside the wagon for the first hour without speaking. Finally, he pulled his horse close enough to speak through the canvas opening. "Miss Clara?" he said awkwardly. He had never in his life addressed a slave with a title before. The word felt strange in his mouth. Are you well?" Clara turned her pale eyes toward him without expression. "No," she said. It was the first word she had spoken since the auction. Edward blinked. He had expected silence. He had expected the practiced blankness he had seen on the faces of enslaved people his whole life, the careful erasure of self that was the only safe armor in a world like theirs. He had not expected honesty. He pulled his horse back and said nothing more for the rest of the ride. When they arrived at Rutledge Plantation, a vast, sprawling estate outside Henrico County with white-columned porches and fields that stretched to the tree line in every direction, Clara was brought not to the slave quarters, but to a separate small house near the main building. A house that had once belonged to a groundskeeper, private, isolated, set apart. The older house servants watched from a distance with expressions that moved between pity and terror. Martha, the head cook, a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s who had worked the Rutledge kitchen for 30 years, pulled a young girl named Lily aside the moment she saw Clara step down from the wagon. "You don't go near that house," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" Lily asked. "Because whatever those men bought her for," Martha said, watching Clara's small, white figure disappear through the door, "it ain't nothing God would put his name on." That night, Samuel called a meeting between the three brothers in the study. The fire was low. The curtains were drawn. The house was quiet in the particular way that houses go quiet when everyone inside them is pretending not to listen. Samuel stood at the head of the room. Thomas sat with his ledger open. Edward stood near the fireplace with his back to his brothers, one hand pressed flat against the mantel, like he needed something solid to hold on to. "The arrangement is simple," Samuel said. "Clara will be available to all three of us. Whoever fathers the child becomes the Rutledge heir. We file the paperwork accordingly. The plantation stays intact." Thomas nodded slowly, calculating. Edward did not move. "Edward," Samuel's voice was even, "this is not a debate." "You're asking me," Edward said without turning around, "to participate in the violation of a human being for the purpose of inheritance fraud." "I'm asking you," Samuel said, "to remember that without that heir you have nothing. No plantation, no income, no name worth carrying. The Hartwell cousins will tear this place apart inside of a year." Edward finally turned. His face was younger than his brother's, softer around the edges, marked by years he'd spent studying theology rather than managing crops and ledgers. But there was something in his eyes that had not been soft for a long time. "She's a person, Samuel." The room went very still. Thomas looked up from his ledger. Samuel stared at his youngest brother for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had not changed. That was the most frightening thing about Samuel Rutledge. His voice never changed. "She is property," Samuel said. "That is the law of this state, this country, and this century. and you will act accordingly, or you will leave this house with nothing but the clothes on your back. Are we clear?" The fire popped. A log shifted. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. Edward looked at his brother's face for a long time. Then he looked away and said nothing. That silence, that one broken, exhausted silence, would haunt Edward Rutledge for the rest of his life. In her small house across the yard, Clara sat on the edge of a narrow cot and listened to the sounds of the estate settling into night. The crickets, the distant hound dogs, the murmur of voices from the slave quarters that she was not allowed to visit. She had been sold 3 times before she was 19 years old. She had learned, the way people learn things that no child should ever have to learn, that screaming changed nothing, that pleading changed nothing, that the only things that sometimes, occasionally, unpredictably made a difference were patience, silence, and watching. Always watching. She pressed her hand flat against the wall of the small house, the rough wooden plank still warm from the day's heat, and she closed her pale eyes. She had heard what the brothers said through the thin walls and the open window. She had heard every word. And deep in a place she barely acknowledged even to herself, something ancient and furious and utterly ungovernable had heard it too, and begun to wake. The first weeks were the worst kind of quiet. Clara learned the rhythms of Rutledge Plantation the way a prisoner learns the schedule of their guards, not because it gave her power, but because knowing was the only thing she still owned. She knew that Samuel rose before dawn and walked the fields alone. She knew that Thomas worked until midnight by lamplight, filling ledger after ledger with numbers that never seemed to satisfy him. And she knew that Edward, the youngest, the one who had called her a person that first night, avoided her small house entirely, as if proximity itself was a sin he could not afford. For 3 weeks, no one came to her door. She almost let herself believe they had changed their minds. Then Samuel knocked. He did not knock the way a man knocks when he is uncertain. He knocked the way a man knocks on a door he already owns, 3 hard, flat raps, and when Clara opened it, he stepped inside without waiting to be invited. He did not look at her face. "You understand your situation," he said. It was not a question. Clara said nothing. Samuel turned to face her then, and for just a moment something flickered across his expression. Not guilt, not quite, but something in the neighborhood of it. The way a man glances at a wound he has caused before he decides not to look at it anymore. "You will be treated well," he said. "You will have food, clothing, shelter. No field work, no auction block." He paused. "As long as you cooperate." Clara looked at him steadily with her pale gray eyes. "And if the child is a girl?" she asked. Samuel blinked. He had clearly not expected her to speak at all, let alone ask that. "We try again," he said flatly. "And if I cannot carry a child?" "Then your value to this household becomes considerably less." He left without another word. Clara stood in the center of her small room for a long time after the door closed. Then she sat down on the edge of the cot, pressed her palms flat on her knees, and made a decision that no one around her would understand until it was far too late. She decided that she would survive this, not escape it, not fight it, not yet, not openly. But she would survive it, and she would remember everything, and someday the remembering would matter. She just didn't know how yet. By midsummer of 1852, the servants at Rutledge Plantation had stopped pretending they didn't know what was happening in the small house near the main building. Martha the cook watched from her kitchen window every evening with an expression carved from pure grief. And when young Lily asked her questions, Martha answered with silence, which was its own kind of answer. But it was old Ezra, the plantation's oldest field hand, a man in his 70s who had survived 4 different masters and remembered things no one had written down, who first said out loud what everyone else was only thinking. He said it quietly, to Martha in the kitchen, late one August night when the heat still hadn't broken. "That woman they bought," Ezra said. "She ain't just unusual on the outside." Martha kept her eyes on the pot she was stirring. "Don't." "I'm just saying what I see," Ezra continued. "Every morning she sits outside that little house before sunrise, just sits, don't move, just watches the sky. And the birds—" He paused. "They don't fly over that house, Martha. You noticed that? Every other house, every other building on this property, birds fly over. Not that one." Martha finally looked up. "Ezra, stop it." "I'm not trying to frighten anyone," Ezra said calmly. "I'm saying that woman has something in her that this family doesn't understand, and they ought to be careful what they've started." Martha turned back to the fire and said nothing. But that night, she left a small bundle of dried herbs on Clara's doorstep. Clara found them in the morning. She looked at them for a long time. Then she picked them up, brought them inside, and hung them carefully from the ceiling beam above her cot. It was the first kind thing anyone had done for her since the auction. By the following spring, 1853, two things had changed on Rutledge Plantation. The first was that Clara was pregnant. The second was that the brothers had begun to quietly fall apart. Samuel had grown harder and more withdrawn, snapping at the field overseers over minor delays, riding the property lines alone at dusk with an expression that none of the other workers could read. Thomas had thrown himself so completely into the plantation's finances that he barely slept, convinced, without any rational evidence, that the Hartwell cousins had found a way to legally challenge the will ahead of schedule. He hired and fired 2 different lawyers in the same month, and Edward had started drinking. Not obviously, not loudly. Edward was not a loud man. But Martha noticed the bottles disappearing from the study cabinet. Lily noticed that Edward sometimes sat on the porch steps after supper until well past midnight, staring at nothing in particular, occasionally talking to himself in a voice too low to hear clearly. One night in April, he made the mistake of talking loudly enough. Clara was returning from the well, one of the few times she was allowed outside after dark, when she passed close enough to the porch steps to hear Edward say, very clearly and distinctly to no one at all, "God forgive me. God forgive all 3 of us." She stopped walking. Edward looked up and saw her. For a moment, neither of them moved. "How long?" he finally asked. His voice was rough with whiskey and sleeplessness. Clara understood what he was asking. 5 months, she said quietly. Edward pressed his face into his hands. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice muffled, broken. "I need you to know that He stopped, started again. "I want you to know that what has been done to you in this house is wrong. It is a sin, and Mr. Edward." Clara's voice was not angry. It was something quieter and more devastating than anger. "Knowing it is wrong and doing nothing is the same thing as doing it." She walked past him into the dark. Edward sat on those steps until sunrise. He didn't drink another drop that night, not because Clara's words had healed him, but because they had cut through to something that alcohol couldn't reach. By September of 1853, Clara's pregnancy was impossible to hide. And that was when the first crack appeared in the brothers' careful arrangement. It happened at dinner, an ordinary evening meal that became anything but ordinary when Thomas set down his fork mid-meal and said, without preamble, "We need to discuss whose name goes on the birth record." Samuel looked up. "Mine, obviously." "Why obviously?" Thomas said. The table went very quiet. "Because I am the eldest," Samuel said, his voice carrying that particular flatness that in his case always preceded something dangerous. "That is not a legal argument," Thomas replied, and his voice had the clipped numerical precision of a man who had spent too many years reducing human questions to columns in a ledger. "The child needs a father of record. If we name you, you hold all the inheritance power, and Edward and I are effectively removed from any claim." "This was never about your claim, Thomas," Samuel said. "It was always about my claim," Thomas shot back. Edward stood up from the table. Both brothers looked at him. "I won't be part of this conversation," he said. "Sit down, Edward," Samuel said. "I said I won't sit down." The force of Samuel's voice was physical. Edward sat. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking slightly, and when he looked up, there was something in his eyes that was past anger, past grief, something that looked terrifyingly close to a decision being made. "The birth record," Samuel said, returning his gaze to Thomas, "will bear my name. That is final. The plantation, the heir, and the Rutledge name continue through me. You will both be provided for under the existing will. That is what Father intended." Thomas stared at his brother for a long moment. Then he picked up his fork and went back to eating, and the calmness of that gesture was somehow the most frightening thing that had happened at that table all evening. Because Thomas Rutledge, when he went quiet, was never finished. He was calculating. And Edward, staring down at his untouched plate, was doing something else entirely. He was praying. Not the practiced formal prayers of the theology student he had once been. Something raw, something that didn't have proper words yet. A prayer that sounded less like devotion and more like a man warning God that something terrible was coming and asking not to be saved from it, but to be given the strength to do the right thing when it arrived. 3 months later, on a freezing night in January of 1854, the midwife's hands shook as she wrapped the newborn in a blanket and counted his fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. She counted again. 6 fingers on the right hand, perfectly formed, pink and small, and unmistakably, undeniably real. The midwife looked up at Clara, who lay exhausted against the pillow, pale as the snow falling outside. Clara's eyes were already open, and she was already watching the door. The midwife's name was Agnes Pryor, and in 30 years of delivering babies across Henrico County, she had never once broken a confidence. She had seen breech births and stillborns and twins that nobody expected. She had kept secrets for wealthy families and poor ones alike, because that was the unspoken contract of her profession. What happened in a birthing room stayed in a birthing room. But she had never seen 6 fingers. Not like this. Not perfectly formed, not symmetrical, not sitting on that tiny pink hand like they had always belonged there. She stood frozen, with the infant cradled against her chest, counting and recounting, her lips moving silently, while Clara watched her from the pillow with those pale, exhausted eyes that never seemed to close all the way, even in the worst moments. "Is the child healthy?" Clara asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper, stripped raw by hours of labor. Agnes looked up. "Yes," she said carefully. "He is healthy. Then why are you looking at him like that?" Agnes didn't answer. She wrapped the baby tighter in the blanket, tighter than necessary, tight enough to cover the hand, and set him gently against Clara's chest. "Rest," she said. "I need to speak with the family." Clara's arm came around the infant immediately, instinctively, the way every mother's arm moves regardless of circumstance or suffering. She looked down at her son's face, and for just a few seconds, the watchfulness left her eyes entirely. What replaced it was something so unguarded and so human that Agnes had to look away. She went to the door and found all 3 brothers exactly where she expected them. Samuel closest, Thomas just behind, Edward furthest back with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. "The child is a boy," Agnes said.
Samuel exhaled. The relief on his face was immediate and profound. "Strong?" he asked. "Strong," Agnes confirmed. She paused. The hallway felt very narrow suddenly, very airless.
"But there is something you need to see." Samuel pushed past her into the room without hesitation. He looked at Clara, a brief, dismissive glance, then reached down and pulled the blanket back from the infant's right hand. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Agnes counted them. Then Samuel said, very quietly, "What is this?" It was not a question. Thomas stepped forward and looked. His face did something complicated, the financial part of his mind visibly trying to calculate whether this changed anything, while the rest of him struggled to catch up with what he was seeing. Edward looked last, and Edward went pale. "Samuel?" Edward said. His voice had a quality Agnes had never heard in a grown man before, something between recognition and horror, like a man who has just heard a sound he prayed he would never hear again. "Samuel, look at me." Samuel did not look at him. "Samuel, do you remember Father's right hand?" The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Thomas turned slowly toward Edward. "What did you just say?" Edward's voice was shaking now, but he didn't stop. Once he started, he seemed unable to stop, like a man who has held a stone underwater for too long and finally lets it surface. "Father's right hand. He had 6 fingers. You remember, he always wore gloves. He never. Nobody outside this family knew. But we knew. We saw it as children. Samuel, you know exactly what I am saying." "Stop talking," Samuel said. "The baby has Father's hand, Samuel." "I said stop." "That baby is Father's son." The words landed in the room like something physical. Agnes pressed herself against the wall. Thomas sat down heavily on the edge of the nearest chair, as if his legs had simply stopped working. Samuel stood absolutely still in the center of the room, and the stillness of him was the most frightening thing Agnes had ever witnessed in a confined space. Clara had not moved. She held her son against her chest, and she looked at Samuel Rutledge with her pale gray eyes, and there was nothing in those eyes that resembled surprise. Samuel turned to look at her. "You knew," he said. Clara said nothing. "You knew," Samuel repeated, and his voice had dropped so low that Agnes could barely hear it. "Before. You knew before the child was born." "I suspected," Clara said quietly. "How long?" Clara looked at him steadily. "Your father purchased me 8 months before you did. He kept me at the house in Richmond before the auction for 4 months." She paused. "I told the auctioneer in New Orleans. He did not care. It did not change my price." The sound that came out of Samuel Rutledge then was not a word. It was not quite a sob and not quite a scream. It was the sound a man makes when the architecture of everything he has built, every justification, every calculation, every cold and ruthless decision, collapses inward at once. He turned and walked out of the room. Thomas did not follow him. Thomas sat in the chair with his ledger unopened on his knee and stared at a fixed point on the wall. And Agnes watched the man's face cycle through denial, calculation, and something that she could only describe as the slow, grinding recognition that no number in any ledger was going to fix this. Edward crossed the room. He stopped at the side of Clara's bed, and he looked down at the infant, his father's son, his own half-brother, born to a woman his family had bought and destroyed. And he wept, openly, without shame, the way men of his generation and class were never supposed to weep. He pressed his hand over his mouth, and he wept, and Clara watched him, and she did not comfort him, because she had nothing left to give in that direction. Agnes slipped out of the room before anyone thought to stop her. She made it as far as the kitchen before Martha caught her arm. "Agnes." Martha's voice was low and urgent. "What happened in there?" Agnes looked at the older woman. In 30 years, she had never broken a confidence. "Martha," she said, "get Ezra. Get him now." By morning, the whisper had moved through the slave quarters like smoke through a cracked door, quiet, unstoppable, finding every gap. No one said it loudly. No one said it in front of the brothers. But by the time the sun cleared the tree line, every person on Rutledge Plantation who was not a Rutledge by name knew the essential shape of the truth. Josiah Rutledge, the dead patriarch, had fathered a child on the woman his sons had purchased. The six-fingered baby was not an heir. He was a ghost. A reckoning wearing skin. Ezra sat outside his quarters in the early morning cold and said nothing to anyone for a long time. Then he said to Martha, who sat beside him, I told you that woman had something in her." "She didn't do anything," Martha said sharply. "That's not what I mean," Ezra said. He was quiet for another moment. "That child was always going to be born. That truth was always going to come out. Some things can't be buried, no matter how much money you put on top of them." Inside the main house, Samuel had not slept. Agnes could have told anyone who asked, though no one asked her, that she had seen men come apart before, and the dangerous ones were never the ones who raged. The dangerous ones were the ones who went completely, ultimately still. Samuel was still. He spent the morning alone in his father's study, the room he had claimed immediately after Josiah's death, replacing every portrait, every piece of furniture, every visible trace of the man who had preceded him. He sat at the desk and he thought, and the thinking he did was not the thinking of a grieving son or a shamed man. It was the thinking of a man who has suffered a tactical setback and is reorganizing. By midday, he had made 3 decisions. The first was that Agnes Pryor would be paid, handsomely, immediately, in cash, and would sign a statement declaring the infant sickly and unlikely to survive. The second was that the child would be removed from the plantation within the week, declared dead in any official record that might exist, and placed, quietly, anonymously, with a free black family further south with enough money to ensure their silence. The third was that Clara would be sold again, quickly, far away, to someone who would never connect her face to the Rutledge name. He called Thomas into the study and laid out the plan with the flat, efficient precision of a man detailing a crop rotation schedule. Thomas listened without interrupting. When Samuel finished, Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And Edward?" Samuel looked at his brother. "Edward will do what he is told," Samuel said. Thomas nodded slowly, but there was something in his eyes, a small, carefully hidden flicker, that Samuel, in his cold focus, did not notice. Thomas was still calculating. He had been calculating since the night before, and the calculation he had arrived at was not the same one his brother was running, because Thomas had already spoken to a lawyer. Not the plantation's lawyer, a different one. A man in Richmond who handled delicate matters for families with complicated inheritances and the money to make complications disappear. Thomas had sent a rider at dawn. The lawyer would arrive by the end of the week. Thomas did not tell Samuel this. He simply nodded, closed his ledger, and walked out of the study. In her small house, Clara nursed her son and listened to the boots on the floorboards above her and the raised voices that filtered through the walls and fragments, sharp, clipped, the sound of men who had run out of room to pretend. She looked down at her baby's right hand, 6 perfect fingers. She pressed her lips to each one. "They're going to try to make you disappear," she whispered to him. Her voice was so quiet it was barely sound at all. "But you were born for a reason, and the reason is not theirs to decide. The baby's pale eyes, her eyes, Josiah's blood, a secret made flesh, looked up at her and did not blink. Outside, snow had begun to fall again over Henrico County, covering the tracks of everyone who had come and gone in the night. But tracks, as Ezra knew better than anyone, have a way of reappearing when the snow melts. The lawyer Thomas had sent for arrived on a Thursday. His name was Caldwell Marsh, and he was the kind of man who had made a career out of knowing which questions not to ask. He rode up to Rutledge Plantation in a black coat and carried a leather satchel that looked heavier than it was, and when Samuel met him at the door and extended his hand, Marsh shook it with the practiced warmth of a man who had shaken 1,000 hands belonging to 1,000 men who all believed they were the smartest person in the room. Samuel had not been told Marsh was coming. He found out when Thomas appeared in the doorway of the study that morning and said simply, "I've brought someone who can help us." Samuel looked at his brother. Then he looked at Marsh. Then he said, very quietly, "Thomas, a word. Alone." Thomas didn't flinch. "Everything I need to say, I can say in front of Caldwell." It was the first time in their lives that Thomas had openly refused Samuel's authority. The air in the hallway changed. Marsh, to his credit, studied the floorboards with great professional interest and said nothing. Samuel stepped back and let them both into the study. What followed was not a conversation. It was a negotiation between two men who had grown up in the same house and understood each other with the particular cold clarity that only siblings achieve. The kind of understanding that has no warmth in it at all, only precision. Thomas had contacted Marsh not to protect the family's secret, but to document it. Not publicly, not yet, but in a sealed legal record that Thomas alone controlled, a record that named Josiah Rutledge as the biological father of Clara's son, that detailed the arrangement the three brothers had forced upon Clara, and that established Thomas as the only living Rutledge with full knowledge of the truth. It was, in plain language, insurance. If Samuel moved to consolidate the entire inheritance under his name alone, which Thomas had correctly anticipated, Thomas would have a weapon. Samuel listened to all of this without speaking. When Thomas finished, Samuel turned to Marsh and said, "Get out of my house." Marsh looked at Thomas. Thomas nodded once, and Marsh gathered his satchel and left with the unhurried dignity of a man who had been thrown out of better houses than this one. When the door closed, Samuel turned on his brother with a fury so contained it was almost silent. "You would destroy this family," he said. "You would burn everything Father built, everything we have, for your own protection." "I would survive," Thomas said simply, "which is more than you've planned for either of us." They stood facing each other in the study, where their father's ghost seemed to press against every wall, and neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Samuel said, "Where is the document?" "Safe," Thomas said. "Thomas, safe," Thomas repeated, and the way he said it made clear that no amount of pressure, physical or otherwise, was going to change that answer today. Samuel turned away. He stood at the window with his back to his brother, and Thomas watched him. And even Thomas, who had spent years reducing his older brother to a set of predictable variables, could not read what was happening behind Samuel's silence. What was happening was this. Samuel was making the fourth decision of the week, and it was the worst one he had ever made. He decided to move forward anyway. Agnes Pryor had already accepted the money. The statement had been signed. Officially, the six-fingered infant was sickly, not expected to survive the winter. Samuel had the document in his desk drawer before Marsh had even arrived. Now he needed Clara gone. He gave the order to his head overseer, a hard-faced man named Briggs, who had worked the plantation for 15 years and understood that his continued employment depended on his ability to not ask certain questions. On a Friday evening in early February. "Tomorrow morning," Samuel said, "before sunrise, She goes to the Beaumont broker in Richmond. Cash sale. No documentation of origin. He'll move her south within the week." Briggs nodded and left. That night, Martha heard something from the kitchen that she would describe for the rest of her life as the worst sound she had ever heard. And Martha had heard a great many terrible sounds in her years on that plantation. It was the sound of Clara in her small house singing to her infant son. A low, wordless melody that moved through the thin walls and across the cold yard and into the kitchen like something that had no business being beautiful under the circumstances, and yet was. Martha wiped her face with her apron and went to find Ezra. "They're selling her tomorrow," Martha whispered, "before dawn." Ezra sat with his hands on his knees and was quiet for a moment. "The baby?" "I don't know." Ezra stood up slowly with the deliberate care of a man whose body had been worked hard for 7 decades. "I'm going to tell her," he said. "Ezra, if Briggs catches you—" "Then Briggs catches me," Ezra said. He looked at Martha with eyes that had seen too much to be frightened by one more thing. "That woman deserves to know what's coming. She deserves that much." He went to Clara's door and knocked softly 3 times. Clara opened it immediately, as if she had been standing just inside waiting. She had the baby wrapped against her chest. Her pale eyes moved to Ezra's face and read it in 1 second. "When?" she said. "Morning," Ezra said. "Before light." Clara nodded slowly. She had known something was coming. She had always known something was coming. That was the particular burden of her kind of awareness. She was never surprised. She was only confirmed. "Will they take him?" she said. Her voice was steady. Only her arms tightened around the infant. Ezra couldn't answer that, because he didn't know. And they both understood that not knowing was the worst possible answer. "There is one person in this house," Clara said quietly, "who might stop it." Ezra looked at her. "Mr. Edward?" she said. Ezra was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward the main house without another word. Edward Rutledge had not been sleeping. He had not slept properly in weeks, not since the night of the birth, not since he had stood at Clara's bedside and wept in a way that had cracked something open in him that he did not know how to close again. He was sitting in his room with an unopened Bible on the table beside him when he heard the knock at his door. He opened it and found Ezra standing in the hallway. Ezra told him what he knew, plainly, directly, without softening. Edward listened. As Ezra spoke, the color left Edward's face gradually and completely, the way daylight leaves a room when a cloud passes over the sun. When Ezra finished, Edward said, "He's sending her away tonight. Tomorrow, before dawn," Ezra said. "The baby, I don't know." Edward reached past Ezra and grabbed his coat from the hook behind the door. He went to Samuel's room and he didn't knock. He walked straight in. Samuel was awake, sitting at the small desk by the window, and he turned with an expression of pure, cold fury at the intrusion. "What in the—" "You are not selling her," Edward said. His voice had none of the trembling uncertainty of the past months. It was flat and clear and final in a way that Samuel had never heard from his youngest brother before. "You are not taking her child. And if you do either of those things before sunrise, I will ride to Richmond myself, and I will tell every lawyer, every judge, every newspaper editor I can find exactly what happened in this house." Samuel stood up slowly. "You would destroy the family name." "You already destroyed it," Edward said. "The moment you bought her, the moment you made that arrangement, the moment you let Father's secret walk in through the front door and pretended you didn't recognize it." He stepped closer. "I have been silent too long. I am done." The two brothers faced each other in the dark room. and this time it was Samuel who looked away first. He did not cancel the sale that night, but he did nothing to speed it either.
And in the hours before dawn, Edward went back to Clara's house, and he sat outside her door in the cold, and he stayed there until the sky began to lighten. It was not enough. He knew it was not enough. Briggs came with 2 other men at first light, and they took Clara, and they took the baby. And then, at the last moment, at a word from Briggs that no one fully explained, they handed the infant to Martha and loaded only Clara into the wagon. Clara did not scream. She looked back once, at her son in Martha's arms, at Ezra standing behind her, at Edward on his feet at the edge of the yard with his hands clenched at his sides, and her pale eyes moved across all of them with an expression that was not surrender and not rage, but something older and more permanent than either. Then the wagon moved, and she was gone. Edward stood in the yard until he could no longer hear the wheels. Then he went inside, and he wrote 2 letters. The first was to a pastor he knew in Philadelphia. The second was to a free black family in North Carolina he had been quietly corresponding with for the past 6 months, a family with no connection to the Rutledge name, no knowledge of its history, and enough kindness in them to raise a 6-fingered boy without asking too many questions about where he came from. He sent both letters the same morning, and then he began making his own arrangements to leave. Within 5 years, the Rutledge Empire dissolved with a completeness that people in Henrico County would talk about for a generation. Samuel lost the plantation to debt collectors in 1857, the result of financial decisions made by a man who had stopped thinking clearly sometime around January of 1854. Thomas vanished in 1858, last seen boarding a train in Richmond amid rumors of fraud charges involving investors in 3 separate states. The sealed document he had prepared with Marsh was never found. Whether he destroyed it, or took it with him, or buried it somewhere no one ever thought to look, remained a question without an answer. Edward left Virginia in the spring of 1854 and never came back. He spent the rest of his life working with church missions in the North, and if the people around him noticed that he carried a particular grief that never fully lifted, they understood without asking that some men come north because they are running towards something, and some because they are running from something they did and cannot undo. He never spoke publicly about Clara, but in a small notebook found among his belongings after his death in 1891, there was a single entry dated April 1854. It read, "I gave him to the Hensley family in Chatham County. His name is James. He has his mother's eyes. God willing, no one will ever find this house." For more than a century, the story existed only in fragments: a medical note referencing an unusual birth, a plantation record with a name scratched out, an auctioneer's log from New Orleans with a sale price so high it had been circled by some later reader who could not believe it. And then, in the 1970s, a historian named Dr. Patricia Wells began assembling those fragments at a library in Richmond, and what she pieced together, slowly, painstakingly, from documents that had survived only by accident, was not just a story about one family's scandal. It was a story about what slavery actually was, stripped of every polite historical abstraction. It was a woman bought and sold and used and discarded. It was 3 men who knew it was wrong and did it anyway. It was a dead man's secret, given a body and a hand with 6 fingers, and set loose in the world to do the one thing that powerful people always underestimate the powerless of doing: to survive, to remember, to make sure that what was done in the dark eventually finds its way into the light. Clara Whitmore was sold 4 more times after leaving Rutledge Plantation. Her trail disappears from the records in Mississippi in 1861, the year the war began, and the record-keeping of human property became, mercifully, a dying practice.
Whether she survived the war, historians cannot say with certainty.
But James Hensley of Chatham County, North Carolina, a free black man registered in the 1870 census with 6 fingers on his right hand, had 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and descendants who are alive today. And none of them, until Dr. Wells started asking questions, knew why their ancestor had been given away in the dark before sunrise on a February morning in 1854, or what his mother had whispered to him in the hours before they took her away. But some of them, when they heard the story, said they had always felt it, the way you feel a truth that has been kept from you for a long time, not as a shock, but as a recognition, as something that has always been present just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to finally say the words out loud. History has a way of doing that. The truths that powerful men bury deepest are the ones that grow the longest roots.